The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our esteemed panel, and the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record. Members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. For far too long, the United States has acted timidly in the face of increased Russian aggression, unwilling to confront Putin for fear of provoking a confrontation, even though Putin, like other tyrants, only responds to a position of strength. And it isn't just the executive branch. Congress has played its role too. For years, administrations have been offering concessions to Russia, and Congress has allowed this to happen. The Bush administration presented a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement, a 123 agreement, to Congress, despite concerns Russia was then providing Iran with nuclear technology and providing Syria with advanced conventional weapons in violation of the Iran, North Korea, and Syria Non-Proliferation Act. In fact, the Bush administration had sanctioned state-owned Russian entities for Iran-related violations. I led the effort then to block that agreement. President Bush withdrew the proposed nuclear accord, but only after Russia invaded Georgia. That didn't stop the Obama administration from falling into the same trap, officially submitting to the U.S.-Russia nuclear cooperation agreement to Congress in 2010, despite overwhelming evidence of Russian involvement in Iran's nuclear and conventional weapons program and congressional efforts to strengthen sanctions against Iran. Russia repeatedly acted as interference for Iran at the UN, protecting it from scrutiny and increased sanctions, all the while itself violating U.S. sanctions against the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. Yet we failed to hold Russia accountable. In fact, as part of the Obama administration's reset, the U.S. lifted several sanctions against Russia, including sanctions against arms exporter Ros-Lehtinen, which admitted it was shipping advanced missile defense systems to Syria. In 2010, the administration agreed to sign over the control of Uranium One, the U.S. uranium processing facility, to the Russian government, again, despite overwhelming national security concerns. As then ranking member of this committee, I spearheaded a letter alongside the ranking members of the House Financial Services, Armed Services, and Homeland Security committees, urging the Treasury Secretary to oppose this move. Another consequence of ignoring Russia's behavior was the decision to overturn the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, paving the way for Russia to join the WTO, World Trade Organization, and granting Putin permanent normal trade relations. This was part of the deal with the devil in order to get the Magnitsky Act signed into law. And though we managed to get that signed into law, an important bill, the previous administration failed to use its authorities to sanction Russia's worst human rights violators. So where are we now? We've established a long history of failing to use the tools the United States has available to it in order to hold Putin and the Russian regime accountable. Putin's support for Assad has guaranteed that the conflict will continue and that tens of thousands more will die. His alliance with Iran has given Tehran the tools it needs to one day become a nuclear power with strong conventional arms, including advanced missile defense capabilities. He is bolstering General Haftar in Libya, making it almost certain that no progress toward reconciliation will be made there in the near future. Reports indicate that Russia may be deploying troops or possibly wanting to set up a base at the border of Libya and Egypt. Putin is ensuring that Russia ties itself to the energy and military sectors of many countries in the region, giving him leverage and influence in countries that have viewed us with mistrust since the Arab Spring and the Iran nuclear deal. Russia is not our ally, not in Syria, not in Iran, not on human rights issues. We should not be afraid to push Putin back. He is a strong man, and tyrants like him only respond to strength, not just perceived strength, but actual strength. Russia is fragile, And this show of force is just that, a show by Putin. It is time for the U.S. to reclaim our leadership role on the global stage, and particularly in the Middle East and with respect to Russia. Yesterday, the Senate passed an amendment to the Iran sanctions bill that included Russia sanctions. And while I support efforts to hold Russia accountable for its cyber activities and its activities related to Crimea, I hope that this will be only the first step toward a more holistic approach to holding Russia accountable for its activities which threaten U.S. national security interests and global peace and security. And with that, I'm proud to yield to my ranking member, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for agreeing to hold today's hearing. Russia has been in the news a great deal lately, but what has been absent in much of the reporting is a clear analysis of what exactly Russia's foreign policy objectives are under Putin's rule. Today, we have a chance to focus on the Middle East, where Russia has demonstrated again and again a disregard for human rights and for human life. Russia's posture in the Middle East would be troubling in any context, but given the bizarre relationship between this administration and Russia, it is even more pertinent that we as the United States Congress understand why ceding our role as the leader in the Middle East to Russia runs counter to our own national security interests. And we cannot have a full understanding of this administration's foreign policy until we know more about this administration's ties to Russia. Russia's relationship with Iran, its support for the Assad regime in Syria, and its willingness to align itself with authoritarians shows brazen disregard for international norms and the rule of law. Are these decisions made solely to counter American objectives and form a bulwark against the United States? The Soviet Union was the first country to recognize the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979, and the relationship between Iran and Russia has remained close ever since. No nation has contributed more to Iran's nuclear program, sold more weapons to Iran, or been more willing to defend Iran's indefensible actions in international fora. As Iran has worked to destabilize nearly every country in the Middle East, Russia seems willing to overlook every Iranian transgression in pursuit of its own ambitions. In no Middle East country has Russia done more to deserve international condemnation than in Syria. Not only has Russia propped up Syria's war criminal president with arms and funds, but Putin's forces have actively attacked opposition forces allied with the United States, as well as countless civilian targets on behalf of the Assad regime. Reports from Aleppo indicate that Russia used bunker-busting munitions to attack hospitals on a regular basis, reducing to rubble underground health facilities that had been out of reach to Syrian forces. When Assad ordered chemical attacks on civilian populations in April of this year, the planes flew out of a base shared with the Russians, and one would be hard-pressed not to conclude that the Russians were aware that gas was stored at that base. Yet Russia chose not to condemn the attack, which violated the very agreement Russia helped negotiate to rid the country of chemical weapons, or to apologize for their complicity. Instead, they spent days blocking meaningful UN Security Council resolutions condemning this heinous attack on children and babies. Russian actions in Syria have lent support to Hezbollah, a terrorist organization, and other Iranian-backed militias. There are reports that Russia has provided Hezbollah with long-range tactical missiles, laser-guided rockets, and anti-tank weapons. And on more than one occasion, Russia has provided air cover for Iran-backed operations. Oddly, the Russian ambassador to Israel this week went to great lengths to explain why Russia doesn't consider Hezbollah or Hamas terrorist organizations, stating that they had yet to attack Russia or Russian interests. Claiming his involvement in Syria as a way to prevent the spread of ISIS terrorism, Putin has been willing to cast aside international norms and order to ensure his own political future. Our president has repeatedly talked about how nice it would be if we could fight ISIS together with Russia. Except there's one problem. Russia has repeatedly attacked the very forces the United States has aligned itself with in the fight against ISIS, while supporting the action's very regime that we consider the largest state sponsor of terrorism. I'm not sure we need clearer proof that Russia's strategic objectives in the region are in clear contravention with our own. Is the Kremlin's willingness to align itself with the region's worst actors a projection of strength, or rather a reflection of Putin's deep insecurities? We have an administration that seems to be willing to give Putin the benefit of the doubt and even to drive policy in the region without much questioning. We must push back against every effort from this president and his allies to legitimize Russian behavior or to draw false equivalence between Russian actions and those of the United States, as the president did on national television when asked on Fox News about Putin being a killer. Even as Russia supported brutal dictators and worked to undermine American alliances, President Trump has complimented Putin, calling him a very strong leader and benefiting from the Russian interference in our elections, suggested partnership with the Kremlin, shared the closely held secrets of allied intelligence agencies with Russia's top diplomats. There is obviously a lot more to discuss. Russian activity now spans throughout the region, but I am confident that our conversation today will only solidify the fact that the United States should not, by any means, let Russia drive policy in the critical region of the Middle East. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. And now we'll yield to our members for their opening statements. And if I may, start with Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The previous administration's withdrawal from America's traditional leadership role left a power vacuum around the globe, one that Putin gladly took advantage of. And unfortunately, we are now paying the consequences. Putin's engagement in Syria and the Middle East has complicated our own strategy for dealing with ISIS and Iran and a litany of other major issues in the region. As the U.S. works to defeat ruthless terrorist groups, Mr. Putin undermines our efforts the entire way by lending support to the Assad regime, continuing to test the limits of our allies, and supplying weapons systems to Iran. It's clear that Putin hopes to restore Russia's economic, military, and geopolitical influence around the world by capitalizing on the instability in the Middle East. Putin saw an opportunity to win over regional leaders by questioning the credibility of long-term support from the United States, and to some extent, this strategy has worked. However, I also believe that there are plenty of tools for this new administration to use to bring both stability and balance back to the region, and I hope we discuss some of those today. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and you and Mr. Shabbat are my friends, but to listen to both of you, you'd never know Donald Trump's in the White House. Apparently, everything going on in the Middle East is the fault of somebody else whose name is not Donald Trump. You'd never know that Donald Trump is under investigation and his campaign is under investigation because of his ties and their ties to Russia. You'd never know Russia hacked into our election campaign, verified by all of our intelligence community. You'd never know that Donald Trump boasted of firing the FBI director because of the Russia thing with the Russian foreign minister. You'd never know that it was Donald Trump that praised Vladimir Putin as a strong man and liked the fact that Putin had said nice things about him. Could that be enabling behavior? I think so. And I think that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room we need to be talking about. So you can pretend all you want that it's all Obama's fault, but we got a real-life problem right now in real time in this White House, and that's the Donald Trump presidency.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. An enabler. Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized.
4 days ago was the 30th anniversary of President Reagan going to Berlin and saying, "Tear down the wall." While having been a senior speechwriter for President Reagan for 7.5 years, I had a chance to have some input, but I did not write that speech. However, I was the one who smuggled that speech to President Reagan so that the senior staff wouldn't take it out before he had a chance to see it. And once he did see it, he withstood enormous pressure to go there and speak the truth. Ronald Reagan then led this country to peace with the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan believed in peace through strength, but let's make it very clear, he believed in peace. And he was the one who brought whatever good chance we have to have peace in that part of the world. He's the one who made it happen. And I will tell you that what we have right now, and I'm afraid I disagree with all of my colleagues, what we hear now is war talk, something that will only lead to war, and it's not leading to treating Russia as a power that we need to negotiate with, as Reagan did for the cause of peace. I will tell you right now that I called up Condoleezza Rice early on when I heard that that their economy was in such a free fall because the West isolated Russia economically after communism fell. They needed to put their scientists to work. They made an agreement with Iran. And I said, this is horrible, but they've got to do it because they got to make the money. And I said to Condi, I said, look, let's offer them a deal. They can make 2 nuclear power plants in Australia or New Zealand. We'll get it financed by the World Bank. It won't cost a penny, and then we won't have this horrible country, Iran, mullah regime, with nuclear weapons 20 years from now. And you know what she said? She said, that's never going to happen, Dana. Well, I'll tell you this much. We have people who can't get over the Cold War, and they're pushing us towards policies of antagonism and repeated, unrelenting hostility that will lead us to war. Ronald Reagan wanted peace in this world, and so do I. This is not the way to a more peaceful world or even a freer world.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Liu of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for this important hearing on Russian aggression. I find it highly disturbing that just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported our president still questions the intelligence community's assessment that Russia engaged in massive cyber attacks on the United States last year. I'm one of 4 computer science majors in Congress. I read the classified report. I've had classified briefings, and the President of the United States is simply lying when he says another country could have done it. It was Russia. And we cannot properly respond to Russia if our own president will not accept basic facts. But thank goodness we have Congress. Thank goodness the U.S. Senate today overwhelmingly passed increased sanctions on Russia. I urge the House of Representatives to do the same. We had a foreign power commit hostile acts against this country. That is not acceptable. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess we're going to be in a debate over the administration and not Russia. I will remind everybody, though, that President Trump actually is the person that enforced the red line in Syria and destroyed an airfield as a result of the use of chemical weapons. Madam Chair, thank you for doing this, and I thank our guests for being here and giving us your time. I just want to say in my opening statement that Russia has blood on their hands in Syria, as well as many other places. In 2015, America mistakenly and tragically bombed a hospital in Afghanistan, and as a result, the world rightfully called that out, and America made amends. We found ourselves accountable. But every day, medical facilities, hospitals, places where innocent people live and work and simply try to exist in their life are bombed by the Assad regime and backed and bombed by the Russian regime. This is pure and despicable evil. When our country makes a mistake, we hold ourselves accountable to it and try to make sure we do it better next time. When Russia, they don't make mistakes. They target with precision-guided munitions innocent lives. This is not a country that we can put an olive branch out to and say, you are just like us, you are also a great power. This is a country with an economy the size of Italy. With that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Very eloquent. Thank you, sir. Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Member Deutsch, for calling this important hearing today, and thank you to our distinguished witnesses for offering your testimony. I want to especially thank you, Mr. Kara-Murza, and say how glad I am to see you here, healthy and as outspoken as ever, drawing light to the Russian government's activities at home and around the world. Your bravery in the face of intimidation is an example to us all, and a reminder of how lucky we are as Americans to be able to question our government and call out corruption when we see it. We thank you for your continuing willingness to speak out. There is no doubt that Russia is seeking to expand its influence and reach throughout the Middle East. While I hope that we can partner with Russia to end the horrific conflict in Syria, we have to remember that their goals in the region are not the same as ours. We seem to have an administration that wants to give Russia the benefit of the doubt, despite years of evidence that they will use this to manipulate events to their benefit. Moreover, the overwhelming budget cuts proposed by President Trump will leave our foreign policy apparatus decimated and unable to respond nimbly to crises and provocations. By ceding our leadership role around the world so thoroughly, we will be giving Vladimir Putin the opening he has so desperately sought to create over the last dozen years to increase his power and influence in the Middle East. I hope our witnesses can shed some light on Russia's intentions in the region and suggest steps that Congress can take that will ensure that American interests and national security are protected. And I'll end with one expression of concern, and that is that the Senate passed some strong sanctions yesterday, and it's already being reported that the White House is reaching out in an effort to weaken these sanctions. And I hope that we can send a very strong message that the Congress of the United States is very united in ensuring that severe sanctions are put into place and the Russians are held fully to account. And with that, Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Well put. Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member, for calling this hearing. Russia's strategic objectives in the Middle East and North Africa. The Middle East and North Africa, a region that our interests run both deep and broad, as is going to be said, having read the previous the advanced testimony. History matters. I don't want to take away something you said, but history does matter here, and it is important to understand the history of the region, the history of different interests in this region. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. Again, thank you for being here. But I think we also have to look at this in the context of a discussion that's taking place in this chamber, that's taking place broadly in the country, and that's the President's desire to cut our investment in diplomacy and development. It is a three-legged stool, and if we're going to promote our interests in this region, we need to continue to invest in diplomacy and development as well as defense, and I hope the witnesses will be able to touch a bit on that. I know we're also going to talk about the sale of weapons into the region and how that plays out, and I think that's an important issue that we understand. And finally, I just want to associate myself with my colleague from Rhode Island's remarks about the concern on sanctions. It is important that we continue to push back on Russia's interests and Russia's efforts to destabilize this region. Again, not to take anything away of what the witnesses are going to say, but the sense that this is a zero-sum game. If Russia seeks to win, we have to lose. We can't let that be the case. We have to work with our allies to secure our interests. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Any other members wish to make a statement? And now I'm pleased to introduce our wonderful set of panelists. I'm delighted to welcome my friend and a true hero of democracy, as Mr. Cicilline referred to him, Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, who currently serves as the vice chair of Open Russia, a Russian pro-democracy movement. He was a longtime colleague and advisor to opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, and here he is. And this is an actual poster that was used with some bullet holes there. Thank you. He currently chairs the foundation that bears Nemtsov's name. In response to his activism and opposition, Vlad was poisoned not once, but twice by the vile Putin regime. Putin's cronies continue cracking down on dissidents. Just a few weeks ago, his regime detained a popular opposition leader for simply walking down the street and protesting with his presence. Many people involved are likely eligible to be added to the Magnitsky list. We must show Putin and his henchmen that they will not get away with these abuses. So thank you, my friend, for continuing to stand up against oppression. We all look forward to your testimony, Vladimir. And next, we would like to welcome Ms. Anna Borshevskaya. I'm so proud, I'm going to say it again, Borshevskaya, who serves as the Ira Weiner Fellow at the Washington Institute, focusing on Russia's policy toward the Middle East. She's also a fellow at the European Foundation for Democracy and was previously with the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the Atlantic Council. We look forward to your testimony. Thank you. And finally, we want to re-welcome Mr. Brian Katulis. Saying that right, too. Mr. Katulis is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where his work focuses on U.S. national security strategy and counterterrorism policy. His past experience includes work at the National Security Council and the U.S. Departments of State and Defense during President Bill Clinton's administration. Welcome back. We look forward to your testimony. And Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, we will begin with you, Vlad. Welcome.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much for your kind introduction, far too kind, as always. And thank you also for your leadership here on this Hill for so many years on issues that are so important to so many people. And thank you in particular for your leadership. You mentioned Boris Nemtsov in your opening remarks. And thank you for your leadership in sponsoring the House Bill, H.R. 1863, that would designate the space in front of the Russian embassy here in Washington, D.C. as Boris Nemtsov Plaza to commemorate him and his memory. This is very important to very many people. And thank you also to the member of the subcommittee, Mr. Connolly, for co-sponsoring this same piece of legislation. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, esteemed members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for holding this important and timely hearing and for the opportunity to testify before you. Our subject today is Russia's strategic objectives in the Middle East. And I think before we discuss the substance, it's important also to clarify the terms. What we're talking about today are the objectives of Vladimir Putin's government. For many Russians, including myself, it's a very uncomfortable equivalence to make between our country and the current regime in the Kremlin that has not resulted from democratic elections. The Kremlin's involvement in Middle Eastern affairs today is the most active it has been since the heyday of the Cold War. Just like Hafez al-Assad, with whom Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev professed to be, quote, fighting shoulder to shoulder, end of quote, was Moscow's ally in the 1970s and 80s, so is his son, Bashar al-Assad, today. From the start of the internal conflict in Syria in 2011, Mr. Putin has been a staunch defender of the Assad regime, providing it not only with political support and diplomatic cover, but also, since 2015, with direct military help, as the Russian aerospace forces have conducted bombing raids against Assad's opponents. The Kremlin has blocked 8 Syria-related resolutions at the UN Security Council. Most recently, on April 13th of this year, Russia's acting UN ambassador, Vladimir Safronkov, and I should add, behaving in a manner more appropriate for a bar brawl than for the UN Security Council, vetoed a draft resolution calling for an international investigation into the chemical gas attack in Han Shehun. Vladimir Putin's support for the Syrian dictator is consistent with his long-standing hostility to popular movements, not only in the Middle East, but also in post-Soviet countries like Georgia and Ukraine, where mass protests have toppled authoritarian governments. In the fates of these strongmen driven from power, he sees his own possible fate. In fact, he has himself publicly compared the mass demonstrations that swept across Russia earlier this year, when tens of thousands of people went out to the streets to protest against authoritarianism and corruption, most recently just 3 days ago, both to the Arab Spring and to the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. These protests in Russia were met with a very harsh response, with peaceful demonstrators beaten up by riot police and with more than 1,500 people arrested on a single day. The official foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation that was signed by Mr. Putin mentions, quote, the growing threat of international terrorism, end of quote. Yet the Kremlin's approach to this issue has been ambivalent at best. For example, unlike the United States and the European Union, the Russian government refuses to recognize Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist organizations. This is what Ranking Member Deutsch referred to in his opening remarks. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has met on several occasions with Hamas leader Khaled Mashal. In January of this year, Mr. Lavrov hosted a meeting in Moscow at the Foreign Ministry for representatives of several Palestinian groups, which included Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that are also designated by the US and the EU as terrorist organizations. Asked in a recent interview why the Russian government considers some terrorists to be bad and others good, Russian ambassador to Israel, Alexander Shane, responded that, and I quote, we do not consider them, meaning Hamas and Hezbollah, terrorists at all, end of quote. This comes despite the fact that Russian citizens in Israel have been among the victims of these groups. With so many cultural, historical, emotional, and family ties between Russian and Israeli societies, and with fully 1/5 of Israelis, including members of Israel's government, speaking Russian as their first language, it would seem natural that Russia should treat the State of Israel as a close partner. Instead, the Kremlin's principal ally in the region, alongside Bashar al-Assad, is the Islamic Republic of Iran, where Moscow remains the largest supplier of weapons, where it is actively pursuing new contracts in atomic energy, and which it continues to provide with significant diplomatic support. Vladimir Putin's objectives in the Middle East have been consistent both with his domestic behavior and with his approach to other parts of the world. Support fellow dictators and undermine efforts at democratization, what his foreign policy concept refers to as, quote, ideological values imposed from outside, end of quote. Military involvement in Syria has also been used by the Kremlin for the purposes of domestic propaganda, both to divert attention from economic difficulties at home and to back up the claim that Mr. Putin has restored Russia's status as a great power, a claim that is hardly consistent with reality. A reminder of this came just last month, as the leaders of what is now known as the G7 held their annual summit in Sicily for the 4th time now without Russia, which was suspended from the group of major world powers because of Mr. Putin's violations of international law. Thank you very much once again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Good to see you healthy. And now we will begin with you. Thank you.
Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, honorable members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. In my written testimony, I have gone into detail about Russian President Vladimir Putin's strategic objectives in the Middle East and how those work against our own national security interests. But for the sake of brevity, let me summarize. First, Vladimir Putin's intervention in Syria in September 2015 had taken many by surprise, but it's important to remember that Russia's presence in the Middle East is not new. It is its absence during Boris Yeltsin's presidency in the 1990s that is the deviation from history. Putin sought to bring Russia back to the Middle East from the very beginning when he officially came to power in May 2000, and he did so in an anti-Western, zero-sum approach. For Putin to win, the United States had to lose. In the Middle East, and especially in Syria, Putin has multiple goals, but fundamentally, Putin's priority is the survival of his own regime. He wants to stay in power, and survival for him is connected to undermining the West. Thus, Putin uses the Middle East to that end. He steps into vacuums wherever the West retreats and asserts Russia's influence, which sows instability and contributes to terrorism. Putin says he wants to work with everyone in the region, but his actions show a clear preference for the anti-Sunni and anti-US forces. Putin's growing relationship with Iran and continued support for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, two major forces that contribute to terrorism, are a testament to this. Russia's growing alliance with Iran in particular presents a major challenge to US interests in the region. We increasingly talk about a post-ISIS environment, and it is in a post-ISIS environment that this issue becomes especially important. Russia-Iran military ties continue to grow, and frankly, the overall level of closeness between the two countries is unprecedented in the grand scope of over 500 years of history. Together, Moscow and Tehran are in a better position to undermine the US in the Middle East than on their own. For years, Moscow consistently worked to dilute sanctions against Iran and claimed that concerns about Iran's nuclear program are overblown. Moscow also, at the very least, looked the other way when Russian weaponry reached Hezbollah. And as was mentioned previously, Hezbollah is not designated as a terrorist organization in Russia. Kremlin's actions show that Putin cares more about his own interests than international or regional security. In Syria, Putin protected Bashar al-Assad from the very beginning and in multiple ways. Putin says he went into Syria in September 2015 to fight terrorists, mainly ISIS, so that they don't return to Russia. But as was mentioned several times here today, numerous reports indicate that he has primarily targeted everyone else. Putin wants to put the US in front of a choice. It's either ISIS or Assad. And as Putin enables Assad, Assad continues an ethnic cleansing in Syria, which increases refugee flows into Europe, thus helping Putin weaken and divide the West. Russia's role in Libya is particularly important to watch. Putin has been gaining a foothold there by supporting Libya's General Khalifa Haftar. And in the context of US absence, Putin could attempt to do in Libya what he has effectively done in Syria: step into a vacuum, create a short-term fix, and take credit for it and see long-term instability. The line between domestic and foreign policy in Russia is often blurred, and it's hard sometimes to understand because it's different from the West. It's a point that often gets missed. Putin seeks to distract Russia's domestic audience from his own failings, his foreign adventures, pointing to the US as the enemy. These are all distractions in many ways. This is how he legitimizes his regime. Putin fears domestic protest, and he believes that the West orchestrates regime change throughout the world, be it color revolutions in the post-Soviet space, the Arab Spring, or domestic protest against Putin himself. Moscow's overall military moves from Ukraine to Syria suggest that Putin is trying to create anti-access denial, the so-called A2AD bubbles, to limit our ability to maneuver in the region. These are essentially ever-growing buffer zones that he's trying to create. Thus, access to warm water ports has been especially important to Putin, along with political and economic influence in the region. I made a number of policy recommendations in my testimony, but my top few are the following. First, Putin cannot be a reliable partner in fighting terrorism. We cannot work effectively with someone who perceives us as the enemy and seeks to undermine us, and who enables forces that contribute to terrorism in the region in the first place. Second, the United States must actively engage in the Middle East, such as increase security cooperation with our partners to reassure our allies and counter Kremlin's propaganda efforts more effectively. This is the best way to limit Putin's influence. Lastly, we have to remember that there are no quick and easy fixes. But with strategic and moral clarity, the U.S. can reclaim its leadership position in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next witness.
Great. I'd like to thank the acting chairman and the ranking member and all members of the committee for the invitation. It's great to be with you today. My bottom line analysis up front is that Russia's increased engagement and assertiveness in the Middle East since 2015 has accelerated three negative trends within the region that affect U.S. national security interests. One is it has accelerated state fragmentation. Two, it has actually heightened the terrorist threat posed in the region and to the United States. And three, it has reinforced a trend towards autocratic and authoritarian rule. It has done this primarily through its longstanding cooperation with Iran, but its backing most recently of the Assad regime in Syria. Another bottom line up front assessment is that though it's still too early to tell in the Trump administration, I believe that we are seeing the emergence of a strategic posture of the United States in the Middle East that is quite incoherent and not clear where the pieces do not add up. I'd like to use my remarks to talk first for a minute about the strategic landscape in the Middle East, because I think it's very important to stress one key point, that the region itself is in the midst of a long and complicated period of fluid change, and the drivers of that change largely come from within the region, Outside actors like the United States, like Russia, have an important sway and influence, but the primary drivers of change inside the region come from within the actors. Some of it is this competition for influence between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Some of it are these tensions we've seen recently between other major actors like Qatar and other Gulf states. And a big part of it is this rise of non-state actors that we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years, including Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. This competition within the region is multidimensional. It has a military and security aspect, but it has political and economic features that I'm happy to talk about. It is multipolar, meaning that there's not one single actor or force that I see as dominant within the region. So I think this complicated landscape is one that is subject to fracturing, fragmentation, and every action the United States takes, every action outside our actors like Russia takes, it makes a major impact and is quite vulnerable. In my written testimony, I outline 7 key objectives that I see in Russia's behaviors in the Middle East. I'd like to just highlight a few and then move to my assessment of U.S. policy. Number one, it's clear to me that Russia and its actions, particularly since 2015, have been aimed to safeguard against attempts to isolate Russia geopolitically for its destabilizing actions in Europe, in Ukraine, in the United States, and other parts of the world. Part of the reason I think it got engaged was not only to try to undermine U.S. influence in the region, but also to, again, arrest the attempts to isolate it through various means. Secondly, it is tried to maintain a degree of military presence at strategic locations across the Middle East and North Africa. Primarily, we see in the Eastern Mediterranean in Syria. And then lastly, it states that it seeks to contain Islamist terrorism and prevent its expansion into Russia and its own borders. But again, if you go back to my bottom line assessment, the consequence of its actions have been to exacerbate and to worsen that threat. In my last minute, I just wanted to briefly talk about what I see as very worrisome trends, and I think an important role that Congress has to play in asking questions. We have moved from a policy in the previous decade under the Bush administration of perhaps overreach and trying to do so much to change these societies, to one under President Obama of reticence and restraint, to what I think at this stage, 5 months into a new administration, which is quite incoherent at this point. The pieces don't add up. 3 points I'd stress in the emerging strategic posture in the Trump administration and why I think it's important that you're having this hearing and Congress should engage on these issues. Number one, we see a proposed unilateral disarmament of the tools of U.S. national security power, particularly in diplomacy and economic tools. And that's why this bill that several of the members talked about that's in the Senate, I think is an important tool in the arsenal to shape the actions of Russia and Iran in ways that benefit our interest. Secondly, we see an over-reliance on military tactics in the absence of a clear strategy. And thirdly, I also see what I term a creeping U.S. military escalation and a silent surge of U.S. troops in multiple parts of the Middle East, in Syria, in Yemen, and other places. But all of this is in absence of overarching strategy. What's the best way to deal with Russia in the Middle East? The best and most effective thing is to have a coherent U.S. strategy, something that I would submit that we've not had for more than a decade and a half, in large part because of our own unforced errors, in large part because of this complicated landscape I tried to depict in my written testimony and in my remarks today. But Congress has an important role in helping this new administration find greater coherence and develop greater coherence in its engagement strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I thank all of our witnesses for appearing today and for their testimony. My colleague Ann Wagner has to be at a markup in financial services, so I'm going to yield my time and recognize Ms. Wagner.
Oh, I thank the chair very, very much for his indulgence and generosity there, and I thank us all for participating in this important hearing, especially our witnesses today. It is important that the committee actively tracks Russia's military partnerships and military sales in the Middle East and in North Africa. Mr. Kara-Murza, and I hope I'm getting everyone's pronunciations correct today, you are, sir, a brave supporter of Russia's democratic opposition and shoulder great personal risk, sir. I read an interview with you in the National Review and was blown away by your insight into Putin and obstacles to democracy in Russia. I appreciate your leadership. I associate myself with your stubbornness and your willingness to be here today. I'm wondering if you could flesh out for us on the record the difference between Russia's perspective on Ukraine and the Baltic states. What about Ukraine poses a threat to Putin in a way that the Baltics do not?
Make sure the mic's on. Thank you, Madam Congresswoman, and thank you for your very kind words, far too kind. Again, it's an honor for me to be here. And it's a very important question that you posed. And there is actually a qualitative and substantive difference, I think, between Mr. Putin's perception of what is happening, for example, in the Baltic states and what's happening in Ukraine. Successful democratic European Baltic states would not necessarily be a direct example for Russian society because we are so different in many ways. A successful democratic European Ukraine would be an inspiration to so many people in Russia because of our proximity, because we have in many ways a shared history, we have the same faith, we have a very similar language, many cultural links. And when Mr. Putin saw those images of the Maidan in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014, when he saw hundreds of thousands of people standing in the streets of the capital as the corrupt authoritarian leader, Mr. Yanukovych, was hastily getting in his helicopter and fleeing, that was an analogy too close to home for Vladimir Putin. That was not a precedent he enjoyed. He feared that a success of this experiment, of the democratic experiment in Ukraine, would provide an inspiration for many people in Russia. And I think the primary motivation for Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine, for what he's been doing to Ukraine since 2014, has been the desire to prevent the success of the Maidan in Kiev before it would become a model for a Maidan in Moscow?
Thank you very much, and I concur. Ms. Borshevskaya, you've written extensively on the Putin-Erdogan relationship. Do you believe that Erdogan's decision to no longer voice support for the ousting of Assad is related to Turkey's partnership with Russia in the Syrian war? And further to that, how has Russia's historic support for the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, in Turkey altered how Erdogan approaches the Syrian war?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I believe that's exactly the reason why Erdogan has changed his mind. Frankly, I'm not sure if Erdogan is realizing how unequal the relationship is right now between himself and Putin, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, because Russia has long-standing, very deep ties to Kurds. The PKK essentially was created by a communist proxy. Moscow's ties to the Kurds go back over 200 years. This is what Erdogan fears the most, and I think he essentially changed his position on Assad. He said for years Assad must go. He no longer says this in exchange for his ability to at least have some sort of influence in Syria.
In my brief time left, Russian ambassador to Turkey, Andrei Karlov, was fatally shot in December in Turkey. And at the time, Russia and Turkey stated that the murder was the result of terrorism. And one Russian senator said that the answer would be to redouble the fight against terrorism in Syria. Ms. Borshevskaya, can you explain how Russia has directly or indirectly reacted to the murder in the months since then?
Well, for one thing, the first thing that came out in the Russian Kremlin-controlled press that I remember was talk about how these are the murder. These are all. It's a plot to divide Erdogan and Putin. That there's some kind of conspiracy theory, and therefore Erdogan and Putin are just going to keep working together more closely. That they're not going to let these fictitious enemies, these terrorists, keep them apart. Beyond that, there was a very firm response very general statement about terrorism, but again, as we've talked before, these are not real attempts to fight terrorism.
Thank you, and I know my time has lapsed. I yield back and again appreciate the indulgence of the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again to witnesses for really excellent testimony. We appreciate your being here. I'd like to start with the point I made in my opening remarks, which gets at the fundamental difference in Russia's approach to the region, and that's the interview the Russian ambassador to Israel gave just this week, where he made very clear that Russia does not view ISIS the same way it views Hezbollah, and according to translations in the interview, he said, "You equate ISIS with Hamas and Hezbollah, but we think this is wrong." When pressed by the interviewer with, "That's all you can say, there are bad terrorists and good terrorists," his response was, "No, we do not consider them to be terrorists at all." So it's no wonder that Russia has had no problem aligning itself with Hezbollah in Syria and Iran, the largest state sponsor of terrorism. Russia's interests in Syria are about making sure Russia isn't affected by ISIS. And if it means propping up a brutal dictator or empowering a different terrorist organization, one that it sees as less of a threat to its own territory, that seems to be just fine. Apparently, Russia should be reminded that Hezbollah has launched attacks in Europe, or that Hezbollah has 120,000 rockets aimed at Israel, where more than 1 million Russians live. This is precisely the reason that when our president says he wants to work with Russia to fight ISIS, we have deep concerns. I frankly see no outcome in which Russia suddenly separates itself from the Assad, Iran, Hezbollah alliance, and any deal that leaves a permanent Hezbollah or Iranian presence in Syria should be unacceptable to the United States. A sustained military presence in Syria would pose a serious threat to our interests in the region and only serve to further foment Iran's destabilizing behaviors throughout the region. So I'd ask the panel, what is Russia's relationship like with Hezbollah on the battlefield, and to what extent are they cooperating and coordinating with Hezbollah, Iran, or other Iranian-backed militias? Ms. Borshevskaya. Yeah.
sorry. There have been multiple reports that Hezbollah has been learning from the Russian military. And Putin actually has made it no secret. He repeatedly said that the Syria campaign provided direct live training for the Russian military, and this was one among many objectives. He said, you know, there's no better way, there's no better training than real-life combat. And in fact, the Russian military already had 3 such campaigns in the last several years: Georgia, Ukraine, and now Syria. So with respect to Iran and Hezbollah, you know, if you look at what's happening in Syria right now, on the Syria-Iraq border, as you know, it was reported in the press that the U.S., in fact, is getting more involved. There were some clashes with pro-Assad forces. What was happening there is Russia was providing air cover for Hezbollah operations. So from reports that we've seen, there's been a lot of learning. And Hezbollah members even talked positively about how much they've learned from watching the Russians operate.
Mr. Koutulis.
If I could underscore a point, Congressman, that you stressed, Hezbollah is our adversary. It's an enemy. It has threatened, as recently as last week, U.S. troops in southern Syria, as Anna just highlighted. There were clashes, and I talked about a creeping military escalation and a silent surge of U.S. troops. We don't have the large numbers of troops that we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, thank heavens, in the previous decade, but we do have a garrison in southeastern Syria that just last week was threatened by Hezbollah. So this strategic incoherence that I simply do not understand, and I think Congress needs to ask tough questions of the Trump administration of how are you going to work with Russia, which has been in alignment with Iran, which is an adversary to Israel. And nobody, I think, has answered that question in any clear way, especially while Hezbollah is threatening our troops.
And just if you could be very direct, the result of a Russian-trained Hezbollah force in a post-conflict Syria with Hezbollah remaining in place means what to U.S. troops and to our ally Israel?
Well, to our ally Israel, Israel, when I go to Israel, they talk about Iran being their deepest strategic threat. So this is approaches existential. And if I might add, when I look at the Trump administration's budget proposal for 2018 and things that it proposes to do in terms of cutting security assistance to some of those partners, including in Lebanon, that are fighting Hezbollah and its influence, it seems to me that the Trump administration has an incoherent formula that is going soft on Hezbollah, and it's perplexing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The incoherent formula that Mr. Koulos describes, that is not only going soft on Hezbollah, but helping to train Hezbollah imperils our own troops and imperils Israel, and the administration has to acknowledge as much, and the policy has to change. That's why this hearing is so important. I appreciate the opportunity, and I apologize. I'm ranking member of another committee that I have to run to, but I thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Before my friend leaves, let me just note that perhaps you've forgotten that Assad has had 3 decades of a truce with Israel, and let me add that during that time, we were allied with countries that wanted to destroy Israel, our now Saudi new friends. Just wanted to, when your last statement, go, yes, please.
Well, the gentleman, I mean, if the gentleman is, if my friend from California is suggesting that somehow it's in the best interest of the United States to not only accept but encourage a Syria run by a brutal dictator, propped up by a Russian government.
That's not what my statement was.
Propped up by a Russian government that'll simultaneously strengthening Hezbollah and Iran, who is an existential threat to Israel, I would disagree with that, and it is in no one's interest.
That's the way to dodge my point that you are absolutely wrong in your analysis that Assad, over these last 30 years, has been some kind of enemy of Israel. The fact is, we have been supporting enemies of Israel for the last 30 years. Assad has had a truce, the one country where they could have had a truce. And I've given you a chance. Okay, you didn't answer it. You didn't answer it.
Assad is a murderous thug, though?
Mr. Chairman, I gave him his chance to answer my disagreement. He chose not to. The fact is that we have been allied with people who are much more warlike than Assad, and Assad over these last 30 years, have been the one country in which Christians could come and seek refuge. Even from countries in which they were our friends, the Christians would come and seek refuge with Assad because Assad was not putting up with the persecution and destruction of the Christian community. That's what I mean by unrelenting hostility. When you can't see and in any way accept that or deal with it, we're going to come up with the wrong policies. Just like our friend and I respect the open Russia movement. I respect the people there struggling to get rid of the massive corruption that you have in that country. And unfortunately, I don't think you're making much headway right now. And it's not just removing Putin, it's removing a lot of other people in power, the oligarchs, et cetera. But with that said, for you to suggest that the removal of Yanukovych in Ukraine was part of a democratic experience or experiment. Ladies and gentlemen, you had a democratically elected government removed by force, and without that happening, I believe that Yanukovych would have been removed overwhelmingly in the next election. But in collusion with Europe and the United States, powerful forces in the Ukraine overthrew the Yanukovych regime, not allowing democracy to work. It destroyed democracy. Mr. Chairman, I happen to be the chairman of the committee that has oversight over this part of the world. And I would never have a panel with at least some disagreement on the panel. And the bottom line is, you're about as close to any disagreement on it, and you don't. The fact is that we need to, if we're going to have peace in the world, we've got to make sure we're talking with Russia honestly and trying to confront these issues, whether it's Yanukovych or whether, look, our people in the Middle East, they're not democratic countries. You think the Saudis are democratic countries? And the Saudis were involved with killing 3,000 Americans on 9/11. What about the Qatarians who we're talking about right now? You think they wouldn't slaughter the large population that they have if they ever rose up against them? We have to quit trying to judge Russia on a double standard if we want peace in this world, because we got to reach out to them and say, okay, let's be honest. What's in your interest? What's in our interest? I have to believe that peace is in the interest of both of our countries, especially when you got radical Islam that is killing a bunch of Russians just like they're killing Americans. So with that said, I will ask a question and try to get, but I am disappointed that the panel doesn't have at least one witness to try to have a dialogue about these particular issues. By the way, just for my friend, and I'm sorry he left, and I would give him a chance to say this as well. Look, when you complain about any type of this administration's relationship or President Donald Trump's relationship with Russia before he was president, I mean, that doesn't sound anywhere near as insidious as the tens of millions of dollars that were put into the Clinton fund. Clinton has a foundation in which the oligarchs put millions and millions of dollars in and paid her husband huge sums of money into his pocket. And what happened very shortly after that? Well, they get a contract to have America's uranium. My gosh, no one's even mentioning it, as if all the other stuff, talking to an ambassador is some sort of a secret, insidious thing, which it's not, and that's what ambassadors are there for, versus exchanges of millions of dollars. No, we have got, if we want to have peace, and I think free people should be for peace. Our major goal should be for peace, because peace will override and destroy lives and destroy democracy every time. And I thank God that Ronald Reagan brought peace between Russia and the United States. He eliminated the Soviet Union. The Russians pulled back in the greatest peaceful removal of force in a large chunk of territory dealing with their borders in the history of humankind. And then what did we do? We didn't let them in the EU. We isolated them economically. And I will just say that and I played little parts in this. I mentioned the thing about trying to make sure that their nuclear physicists wouldn't be working with Iran. We forced them into this relationship with Iran. And I will tell you one other incident for the record, because I've been involved in this stuff. The Russians offered to back out of the agreement with the Iranians. I have this directly from players in this game, not Russians, but Americans. They offered to withdraw their agreement with the Iranian nuclear agreement if we would work with them on developing the next generation of nuclear power, which is safe and you can't melt it down, et cetera. And you know what? We turned them down. And we said, go play with the Iranians. So a lot of the problems we have now, I think, have been based on we have not reached out to try to work with an honest discussion of differences with a country in which, yes, I'm not trying to say that Putin is a democratic leader. He's oppressive, and he's tied into oligarchs that are crooked and draining the money from the Russian people that should be used for their benefit. So I'm sorry, I'm the only. I know it sounds like they say he's Putin's man. I'm not Putin's man, but I'm the only one who's willing to make the arguments on the other side and try to see that in order to create a more peaceful world. And so, with that said, I'm sorry I took up my whole 5 minutes. I would let them refute me, and I will shut up.
Well, thank you, and we will let them do that. But let me go to Mr. Cicilline first. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I think one of the things that we understand is that our military is most effective when it works in conjunction with our diplomatic work and, of course, with our development professionals. And I'm just wondering whether or not any of the panelists think that it is possible for us to push back against Russian aggression and build a kind of confidence in American leadership that we need through our military expenditures alone, or should we, as members of this committee, continue to fight for robust investments in both foreign assistance and development aid that are such important parts of our foreign policy? As you might know, the President's budget proposes very deep cuts in those areas. Yes, everyone agrees?
Thank you very much. And I want to just briefly say thank you for your kind words also during the introductory remarks. But I'd like, Madam Chairman, if you allow me, very briefly to respond to what Congressman Rohrabacher said. Sure.
Yes, and I won't take from Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, it's very refreshing to see disagreement and genuine debate in a legislative body. Right. That is something we've long forgotten in my country. Mm-hmm. As you know, as a former Speaker of the Russian Parliament, Mr. Gryzlov has said, Parliament is not a place for discussion, and unfortunately that's what it has become under Vladimir Putin. The last time my country had anything resembling a free and fair election was more than 17 years ago, in March of 2000. And this is not me saying it. This is according to observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Mm-hmm. So when I say again and again that please don't equate Russia with the Putin regime, it means very simply that the current regime is not a product of democratic election. It's not a product of the free choice of our people. And you said, Congressman, one thing which I completely agree with. You said, let's not treat Russia with a double standard. And I think this is very important. Yes. We are not worse than you are. We are entitled to the same rights and freedoms that you have. Russia doesn't exist in a vacuum. Russia is a member of the Council of Europe. Russia is a member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. We have clear international commitments with regard to such areas as free elections, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, the rule of law and due process. The Putin regime has been violating these commitments and these principles for years. And it's not okay, if I could say this, for Western politicians, for Western political leaders to say, forget it, let them do whatever they want to do inside the country. Let's do realpolitik. Let's do business as usual with Mr. Putin. Let's deal with him as if he is, a normal, democratically elected leader. That is not right. That is insulting. Because, we have political prisoners in our country who are sitting in jails for their political beliefs. 3 days ago, we had peaceful opposition rallies on the streets of Russia, and more than 1,500 people were arrested and put to jail, including women, including teenagers. This is not okay. We have no freedom of the press in our country on a large scale. All the major media, all the major television networks are controlled by the government. And as I already mentioned, we have no free elections and have not had free elections for many years. So I think it is very important to remember the values. You mentioned President Reagan several times today. And what President Reagan is remembered for in our part of the world is that he always attached great importance to values. And yes, he engaged with the Soviet leadership on several areas, including arms control, but he also, every time he had a meeting with Soviet leader, he put on a list on the desk the list of Soviet political prisoners, and he demanded their release. It would be nice to see something similar in terms of principles from the current generation of Western leaders. Thank you.
Thank you. This sort of building off of those comments, according to CNN, our president has spoken positively of President Putin over 70 times, calling him highly respected within his own country and beyond, and saying he's doing, and I quote, a great job. I'm wondering if you could share what you think the impact of that kind of posture by the American president is with respect to our allies in the region and with respect to our enemies in the region. What message does that communicate? It's sort of mystifying to me, but I'm just wondering, what are the geopolitical implications?
Thank you very much. And well, I think there's enough talk in this town about Russians meddling in your domestic politics. I don't want to be one more. So I don't think it's my place to comment on the administration or any political dynamic in the U.S. But I would say this. I think, if you watch Russian state TV, if you watch Kremlin propaganda outlets, you will hear that we, members of the Russian opposition, go to the West and we ask for money. We ask for political support. We ask for regime change. Of course, none of that is true. All we ask for are two things from Western leaders, including the government of the United States of America, the most important democracy in the world. We ask only two things. One is honesty, to be open and honest about what is happening in Russia. Don't pretend that something is happening that is not happening. Don't call things for what they are not. Just call things for what they are. Just be honest and open about the situation. That is the first thing. And the second thing we ask for of Western leaders, including the United States, is please be true and be faithful to your own principles. Don't enable the export of corruption and abuse from the Putin regime to the West. Don't enable this behavior by providing havens, as so many Western countries have for so long, to those human rights abusers and those crooks and those corrupt officials from the Putin regime who steal in Russia but prefer to spend in the West, and who keep their money in Western banks, who send their kids to study in Western schools, who buy real estate and properties and mansions and yachts in Western countries. And the Magnitsky Act, which was passed by this Congress almost 5 years ago, which introduced this very concept that those people who engage in human rights abuse and corruption should not be allowed to enter the U.S. or use the U.S. financial system. Boris Nemtsov was already mentioned in these hearings. He and I were sitting in the House Visitors Gallery on the day the Magnitsky Law was being passed. And I think every one of you present here voted for this law. And he called it, Boris Nemtsov called it, the most pro-Russian law ever passed in a foreign parliament, because it targets those people who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and who steal the money of Russian taxpayers. And that is commitment to principle. So this is all we would ask for of the U.S. government or any other government in the Western world.
Thank you. I have two other questions. I'm going to just pose them, and you'll have as much time as you need to answer them, I hope, Madam Chairman. The first is, how is Russia managing to pay for all of its costly interventions around the world, particularly in Syria, and to really begin to become even more engaged in areas around the Middle East? Are they perceiving that they're getting a good return on their investment, and have the Russian people made the connection between a decline in their quality of life and Russian efforts in the Middle East? And does that either encourage the Russians to more deeply engage, or what is the kind of long-term implications of that? Because my sense is they don't have the resources to do this without misleading the Russian people about the benefits of that. And then the second thing is, we now know that Russian propaganda, RT, a very powerful outlet for Russian propaganda, has an Arabic channel. And I'd like to know a little bit about what Russia is investing in this propaganda in the Arab world, and is it having an impact, and what should we be doing and thinking about in terms of responding to the powerful spread of propaganda by the Russians through RT in the Arab world? So those are the two.
I want to respond to Congressman Rohrabacher. I agree with everything Vladimir said. I also just want to add very briefly, in terms of President Reagan, you've mentioned him a lot. President Reagan didn't only talk to the Soviet Union. He defeated the Soviets in Afghanistan, for example. He understood that military strength was also important. And I, as a child growing up in the Soviet Union, I
know that I fought in Afghanistan against Soviet troops.
So
you know that, okay?
Sure. Sure, but I just
When
want
I
to
was
make
a
a point.
special assistant to President Reagan.
Sure. No, I just want to highlight
right.
that point. And in terms of your earlier questions about about engagement in the Middle East, the military, and so forth. So first, one thing we can do is we can increase cooperation with our regional allies. And this doesn't require a lot of spending. We need to increase, for example, and I mentioned this in my testimony, increase port visits to the Eastern Mediterranean, to reinforce the notion with our regions that America supports our allies, that it's not retreating. The military could augment exercises beyond those that we already conduct with Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan, and so forth. This is a small but very important, effective measure that we can take. More broadly, in terms of strategic thinking in the region, what the airstrikes of April 7th have shown to Putin for the first time is that the United States will stand by certain red lines, that it's not just talk. Unfortunately, it seemed that it was just a one-off, and as Brian had mentioned, we don't really seem to have a clear strategy. But if Putin understands that there is a clear strategy and that we will back up our talk with actions, that it's not just talk, that's incredibly important to curbing his influence in the region. In terms of spending, in terms of how is Russia managing to do this, I don't have reliable numbers. I'm not sure if anybody really does, because this is a very opaque system. Officially, what Putin had said is that Russia spent something around $400 million in March 2016. I suspect the real numbers are probably higher. That said, it's still not a lot if you compare it to the Russian military budget. What he's been trying to do is do this on the cheap. In Syria, for example, he let Iran do most of the heavy lifting, and this is why these interventions have worked so far for him. How long this is, whether or not sustainable, that's a different question. And lastly, in terms of your question about RT Arabic, yes, RT Arabic is active in the region. It fuels conspiracy theories, frankly, just as it does in other languages. What we should do is not be on the defensive. We're always on the defensive. We're always trying to refute stories that RT puts out. And one reason for that, and I cited a report in my testimony, first impressions tend to be very resilient. And because Russian propaganda, Kremlin propaganda, is not concerned with the truth, they often have a monopoly on first impression because they don't need to think about, investigate what really happened. We need to work with our regional partners, perhaps establish outlets so that we can not just be on the defensive, but actually be on the offensive on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could add your first question about the cuts and the proposed cuts on the State Department. In my opening statement, I characterized it as unilateral disarmament. And in the type of strategy that Russia has for engaging in the region, it truly is unilateral disarmament. Just the assistance component of it, and Congressman, you mentioned Christians in the Middle East, and it's something that touches my heart and we've done a lot of work on at the Center for American Progress. Today, the fight in Mosul in Iraq, there is a post-conflict stabilization effort where we're not even in the ballgame that affects those communities. Some of the oldest Christian communities in the world over the last decade and a half have been run out of the region. And we know what it's like in human history to see when people are killed and murdered simply for what they believe in. And by unilaterally disarming, we're actually leaving those most persecuted and vulnerable populations even more vulnerable because others will fill the gap. In Iraq, it seems that Iran is coming in and trying to buy up property and things like this. And I think it's important for us to talk more about it. Secondly, on the question of RT, I mean, it's of my view, and I mentioned for the last decade and a half, I don't think we've had a coherent strategy across the region. And that is especially the case in the battle of ideas, that after the 9/11 attack in our country here, we had a lot of talk about how do you win that battle of ideas. And the latest episode we see, I think coming from the Trump administration, is his visit to Saudi Arabia and this new Countering Violent Extremism Center in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the image of the glowing orb, if you remember this. This is a place where the United States and Congress needs to ask, what's going on there? What's our involvement? Where's the imprint of our values to talk about values? Where's the imprint of respect for religious minorities like Christians? Is that part of your conception of countering violent extremism in building this partnership with these countries? And I'm all for building partnerships. I've written about it with countries like this, but on our terms, not their terms.
Thank you, and I thank the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Donovan is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I am so proud of the leader of our committee, our chairwoman, for being able to pronounce your names. It's taken me 2 years to say Ros-Lehtinen. And then she announced she's retiring after I got it down. So I would just ask all of our panelists the same question. A lot of the conversation today has been about the administration's policies towards the Middle East, towards Russia. Besides restoring the proposed cuts in the budget, what do each of you think Congress alone could do to have an impact on many of the issues that each of you have brought to our attention today?
Thank you. Congressman, thank you for the question. I think my answer would be to stay true to the values and just to remember the importance of the values. Because actually we haven't really touched on this today, but a lot of the actions that Vladimir Putin takes on the international arena in foreign policy is a direct continuation of what he does domestically in our own country. I mean, if you look at modern Russian history, it has certainly been a pattern, a long-standing pattern, that domestic repression eventually will translate into external aggression. Because, after all, why should you expect a regime that violates the rights of its own people and that disregards its own laws to then respect other countries' interests or international law? There is no reason. And, you know, those people in the leaderships of Western democracies who for so many years, I must say, turned a blind eye to the abuses of democracy, human rights, and rule of law by Putin domestically, you know, the violations of freedom of the press, the political prisoners, rigging of elections, and so on and so forth, one day woke up to the external aggression of his regime in Georgia, then in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and now what he's been doing in the Middle East. These things are connected. So I think it's very important to remember the importance of the principles and the values and issues such as rule of law, human rights, and democracy, both in your approach to U.S.-Russian relations and also to wider approach to foreign policy. That's what I would say. Thank you very much for the question.
I have two very specific ideas. One, I think it's very important for Congress to consider a new authorization of the use of military force because of this creeping military escalation, that the U.S. actually has more forces nearer to the front lines of very complicated battles. And the legal frameworks that we're operating underneath are about a decade and a half old. And it's not just a legal issue, it is what is our responsibility as a nation to, when we're sending people into harm's way, to actually have a coherent understanding of the strategy from the administration. And I think having that debate over a new authorization can press this administration to clarify what it's doing. Secondly, there are a number of arms sales that are proposed with partners in the region. And I've written before in reports like this that we need to use sort of these tools as leverage. We have an enormous amount of leverage. And in this year alone, I've been to Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, the UAE, Egypt, Morocco, a number of countries for my studies, and I've talked to most of the top leaders. And we are the strategic partner of choice. No matter what Russia's done in the last couple of years, we don't use those tools, including arms sales and military cooperation, to benefit stability. So it's those two things. How do we use the tools, in addition to the toolkit on the diplomacy and development? How do we use sort of the authorization for the use of force to press the Trump administration on what its Middle East strategy is? Because we could find ourselves in a shooting war with Iran directly at a moment's notice this summer, or our troops at the receiving end of a chemical attack from ISIS. It is not inconceivable, but we aren't having that debate. And then secondly, the levels of weapon sales that have been proposed, how does this fit within a strategic concept that brings stability to the region?
Yeah, so I would just add, so I think first, authorization of use of force is very important. You know, one of the things that I highlighted in my testimony, and I just want to come back to that issue, Putin is trying to limit our ability to maneuver physically, militarily in the region, in the Middle East. He hasn't quite created full A2AD bubbles. We can still operate, but now we have to think twice. He wants us to think twice. He doesn't want us to, before we were able to just go in, and now we can't do that anymore. We have to think, well, how is Putin going to react? For example, we use cruise airstrikes. The reason why we're using them is because, again, we're afraid for our pilots. Authorization of military use of force, and I would, and I agree with everything that Brian said, and I certainly agree very much with the issue of emphasis on values. Holding hearings like this, frankly, I think a hearing on Russia in the Middle East like this is way overdue. Putin has been involved in this region for a long, long time. Lastly, I think sanctions, and we've seen this happen just this week. Congress is passing sanctions on Iran and Russia, so more conversations along those lines are very important. This is very concretely what Congress can do.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donovan. And I will ask questions, if that's okay, Mr. Cicilline. Thank you. I've been in and out. I'm sorry. Mr. Donovan did a very good job of holding down the fort. Vladimir, you know the Putin regime, and you've been a target of its repression. You understand the motivating factors for its actions. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Putin's domestic issues impact his foreign policy agenda? How important is it for him to be able to say that he beat the United States in Syria, for example? And what is his mindset when it comes to deciding when and how to intervene in many matters in the Middle East?
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for this question. And as you know, the Putin regime has been described on many occasions as a virtual reality regime because it's so dependent on the propaganda image on the television that the image that it creates itself. As you recall, one of the first actions of Mr. Putin in office was to shut down or take over all independent national television networks so that he would control the entire information picture, almost all of it. And so I think it's sometimes underestimated in Western countries how much of what Putin is doing is actually geared for that domestic propaganda image. We already discussed this hearing, the relationship between his aggression against Ukraine and the domestic needs. He was very unhappy about this precedent of mass protests toppling a corrupt authoritarian government. And he was certainly not very happy, or not at all happy, about the prospect of something like this happening in Russia. And he's been open about it. As we mentioned earlier during the hearing, he has himself compared the mass protest against his own rule in Russia to the Maidan in Ukraine, to those color revolutions in post-Soviet countries, to the Arab Spring, and so on. So a lot of the aggression against Ukraine that he's been engaged in was motivated by domestic considerations, to prevent the success of the democratic European experiment in Ukraine before it would become a model and an inspiration for the same thing in Russia. And as regards to the Middle East and his involvement in Syria, if you watch Russian state television, which I would advise you not to do if you value your nervous system, but we have to, unfortunately, and if you watch it, you will see that most of the political talk shows, most of the news programs are dominated by the foreign policy agenda, by Putin's foreign policy adventurism. Before it was Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. Now, in the last couple of years, it's all mostly Syria, Syria, Syria. You're not going to hear about economic problems in Russia. You're not going to hear about the sanctions that Putin himself introduced on the Russian people when he banned the imports, for example, of food products from the US and European Union 3 years ago. You're not going to hear about the problems with healthcare or education, or the many social, political, and economic problems we have at home. All you're going to hear about, are these reports of new military strikes, new bases or new deals to make, to extend the lease of Tartus and Khmeimim. You're going to hear about, you're going to see those images of Russian troops, Russian airspace forces, halfway around the world, carrying out the valiant mission that President Putin has ordered them to. You see this used for propaganda purposes 100%. And it's a very important reason, in many ways, for what Putin is doing, to divert attention of the Russian public from the many problems at home, and to back up the fraudulent, in my view, image that he has created of, Russia rising from its knees and being a great power again. All I say to this is, in the 1990s, which according to Putin were a time of humiliation for Russia, when we had a democratic system of government under President Yeltsin, Russia was invited to join the G8, the most prestigious world club, the group of leading world powers. Under Vladimir Putin, we were expelled from the G8. So where is humiliation in there?
Thank you. Ms. Borishevska, in case you want to chime in on that. Borshevskaya. There we go.
No, I just want to echo what Vladimir said, and I always make the point, and this is why I said earlier in my remarks, the blurred line between domestic and foreign policy in Russia. These are distractions, and you know, it's unclear how long Putin is going to be able to sustain this, but the fact of the matter is, up to date, he's been able to do that, and I think we need to recognize that, you know, we're in this for the long haul, that this isn't just going to disappear in a year or two, that Putin is here to stay, at least in the near future, and we need to have a strategic, coherent response.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Katulis, you state that the leading powers in the region are engaged in a complicated struggle for influence, for power, and the key actors use a wide range of tools to assert their interests. Obviously, this is playing out with between Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain against Qatar. And there are concerns that this will align Qatar more closely with Iran. Russia and Iran obviously have a close relationship. So do you think that there's a space that Russia will move in to take advantage of? And if so, how? How will it align itself with this power struggle? How should the U.S. move to prevent a potential Iran-Qatar-Russia nexus?
I think the first thing the United States should do is speak with a much clearer and coherent voice than it has. And I've met with officials from the Gulf in the past week from a number of these countries. And I think it's hard for most Americans to understand the complexities of the tensions there. It kind of feels like the Hatfields and the McCoys in Arabia, because there's a history there and it goes back and it's a little tribal. Yes, it touches upon perceptions of security threats and terrorism and things like this. But bottom line, the number one thing I think the United States should do is have the senior figures in its administration, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and especially the President of the United States, speak with a much more unified voice about this. And I think it's in their own self-interest. We have an administration which, again, I try to be clinical in my analysis and assessments. And I think it's still largely too early to tell what the complexion of the Trump administration's posture in the region will be. I think they've not sorted out a lot of their own internal sort of debates. And unfortunately, we've seen some of these internal debates sort of fully exposed on Twitter or in different statements or in different gestures. So the most important thing to prevent a cohesive alignment there, and I don't think it's inevitable in any means, especially going back to a point I was making about weapon sales. The United States is about to sell billions more to Qatar, which is where we have a major air base. This is a point of leverage with all of these partners. We are better when our partners are unified. And a lot of the messaging and then the gestures coming from the Trump administration just in the last few weeks cuts against the grain of what I think they were trying to do in talking about an Arab NATO and other things. So a steadier approach, one where we're working together and trying to tease out all of these complexities rather than create disunity or present disunity, I think would be the most important thing.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all three of you. What excellent testimony, and we appreciate it. We hope to have a follow-up hearing on this. And thank you to the audience as well and the members of the press for being here. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.